So welcome to Mussar webinar number 9, which is about humility, Anavah. We're going to explore the midah of humility in this lesson, applying it to both our relationships with others and our relationship with the environment. Let's start out with the themes, okay? We'll look at our topic. We apply this midah to both relationships with others and to our relationship with the earth. Well, let's think about airspace. When we take up too much airspace in a conversation without considering others, or when we spread our belongings over the seat next to us on the bus, we're behaving negligently in the area of humility practice. As you see the themes here, balanced humility is about taking up the right amount of space, neither too much nor too little. In the context of the climate crisis, we must consider how we, as human beings, may be taking up more space than our share of environmental resources. Curbing our carbon footprint is both good Mussar practice and sound global citizenship. So with that in mind, let's look at the first text. It's from Genesis. It's about creation. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that creeps upon the earth." Before we get to our discussion, I see that there is someone that I might be able to bring in this way. Here, Harriet, hi. It's nice to have you on the screen. Let's unmute you. Hold on. There. Good. This way we'll be able to have a conversation. That'll be nice. Now I do not see you. All right, well, we'll keep.
I can see you.
That's great. And I can hear you, so that counts. So that's good. Okay, great. So we were just reading this text from Genesis about God creating human beings in God's image. And the question that goes to this is, do you believe that you've been made in God's image? And if you do, does that make you feel humble or arrogant or somewhere in between? Does it create a sense of pride? So we often answer that by saying that we were made in God's image, and therefore we should try to emulate God and do things that that God would want us to do to make the world better. And so hold on a second, because I want to let some more people in who are late. I'm sorry. We'll go back to our conversation when everyone can participate. Hold on. Here we go. And another person. Yeah, I really like to have everybody be able to participate. So welcome to those who came a little bit late. I'm happy to see you. Okay, or to hear you. And we were talking about this this text from Genesis about our relationship to the earth and our relationship to having been created in God's image. So what I was talking about is that we often say to be humble about this. We emulate God. I'm going to mute you, Harriet. Yeah, unmute when you want to speak. Everyone unmute when you want to speak, because I think that there's an echo here. Okay. Another way of looking at it is that maybe it's been written, and I agree with this theory, that we weren't actually created in God's image. I feel more that we created God in our image because we need help to visualize and explain a concept that's very complicated. We compare God to a king or to a father or to a lord, and I think we do that in order to explain something that's hard to explain. So actually, I see that Rabbi Niman, you're the one who's echoing. So if you want to speak, unmute yourself, because I'm afraid otherwise we'll have an echo. But I'm really anxious to hear what other people think about this topic. So if anybody wants to chime in, please do. And tell whether you feel you're created in God's image, and if so, how that makes you feel, or whether you feel we've created God in our image as an explanation for
I, I
yes.
don't I don't see I don't see us as physically God's image, whether it be the way we look at God as, a father or a king or what and so forth. I think it's more we should live godly, more imitate what I hate to quote another faith, but where they say, what would somebody do?
Well, we can say, what would God do, or what
Yeah,
would the Torah
yeah,
tell us to do, which is pretty much the same thing. And
yeah.
I think that's a really, really good way of looking at it. And if we want to compare what you just said, if we want to put it in the spectrum of humility, that is a very humble way of looking at the idea that we're created in God's image, that we have godliness in us, but it's our responsibility to figure out how to bring that out. I think that's really, really nice. And I think it does show humility. So that's really nice. And that kind of brings me to the humility spectrum. If we look at the midah of humility on a spectrum, it might look like this, with healthy self-esteem, an appropriate sense of self right in the middle. Arrogance would be at one end and poor self-esteem at the other end. And as we go through our texts, I felt when I was reading some of the Hasidic texts that humility was a little closer to poor self-esteem. I'm going to be interested to see what you think. As I did this webinar yesterday with the teen educators, we were especially aware of what we're teaching kids about humility and about a healthy sense of self. So it'll be interesting to see how our discussion goes today. And I want to think about this. In light of the text we just read, which elements of this spectrum does text 1 speak to? What would a self-denigrating relationship with the environment look like? It makes me think of the Jains. It's an Indian sect. They don't pick fruit. They only eat fruit that falls to the ground. And if it's a kind of fruit that bugs really like, they won't eat it because they don't want to take away the nourishment from the insects. And they consider this way of eating non-violent. They would consider it violent to take food from a worm. And so I think they're on the way on the other side of healthy sense of self. What would a humble relationship with the environment look like? Perhaps being aware of our consumption, trying to minimize our carbon footprint. And an arrogant relationship with the environment, I think that would be using natural resources without thoughts of sustainability. I think fracking is an arrogant use of natural resources, my personal opinion. Anybody who'd like to jump in, I'm happy to hear what you think. Okay, so let's look at our personal relationships in the light of this humility spectrum also. The midah of humility is not about meekness. Moses was a great leader and yet is considered a most humble of men. And actually later on, when I have the supplemental materials, there's a really nice one, a nice video about this that you might want to watch and use with your groups possibly. So a good relationship on the humility spectrum would be one where neither party is self-denigrating or domineering. Because the midah of humility is not about meekness, it's about being right in the middle. And then I want to go back to the text we just read from Genesis, because you probably know this, but there are two different times that the creation story is told in Genesis, once in chapter 1 and once in chapter 2. The one we read paints a picture of humanity's dominion over the earth. But the one in chapter 2 offers an alternative, more humble perspective. It says, "And the eternal God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it." So if we want to think about this together, in what ways do we practice humility in our relationship to the earth? And if this is a value to us, I wonder if we're thinking of it as a Jewish value or as just a good citizen value. It would be interesting to see what you think about that. When you think about the earth, do you think of it from a Jewish perspective or just from an environmental perspective?
I think they're the same.
That's very nice. That's absolutely great. And that shows that your Jewishness is just ingrained in you and is just part of it. And you're right, you don't have to separate those two. I think that's great. I really like that answer. Thanks. Okay, let's look at text 2. The root of humility is that one should consider, while at peace and quiet, healthy and rich, that the Creator has done much good to her, and that she is undeserving of all that God has given her. But a person who feels humility before the Creator only when she becomes ill in body, or in any limb, or when her children or friends die, when she loses her wealth or high position, or when she grows old, this may belong to the realm of humility and may be accepted by God, but does not reach the essence of it. So what we're thinking about here is the essence of humility. There's a distinction between humility and being humbled. And so what is that distinction? If anybody wants to jump in, I'll start by saying how I see the distinction. Humility is despite or separate from any kind of thing that happens to you. And we're going to have another text that also talks about this in a little while. And this, and while somebody may be arrogant until they are humbled, the essence is actually to be humble despite what happens to you. I see one more person who's just joined us, and so I'm going to invite her in, and then we'll go on to discuss this some more. Hi, Clara.
Hi.
Good to see you. Actually, I don't see you, but I hear you.
I'm on my phone, that's why.
Oh, well, that's good that I can actually hear you, though, because that way you can join in the conversation. So that's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So what we're discussing now is humility and whether it's something you feel before you're humbled or whether you might not feel it until something happens to make you realize. And I think there are a lot of stories, midrashim and stories in other in other cultures that talk about someone who is arrogant and becomes humbled. And I think that's fine. But I think there are also plenty of people who can feel humility without this happening. And it actually brings me to text 3, which also talks about the feeling of humility outside of things that happen. Before I do, it's about Rabbi Zushia and his brother Rabbi Elimelech, and there's a little background on them. So Rabbi Zushia, his brother was Rabbi Elimelech. Rabbi Elimelech was older by about 5 years. Both of them were born in an unpronounceable city in northeastern Poland, but I'll give it a try. Tykocin, I think. Their father, Rebbe Eliezer Lipa, was the son of a great Torah scholar. That great Torah scholar was also named Rabbi Elimelech, and that's who Elimelech was named after. An interesting thing, well, there's a couple of interesting things. Rabbi Zushia and Rabbi Elimelech became prominent disciples of the other person who's mentioned in this quote, the Maggid of Mezerich. And they're part of his inner circle of students, which was the Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Brotherhood. And Rabbi Zushia, whose interpretation of humility we're going to read in a minute, he was known for his deep emotional approach towards prayer and his great piety. He didn't write any books, but his students collected his teachings in a book called Miramat Zahav. And both Zushia and Elimelech, this is important, they were known for accepting their great poverty with equanimity and eternal optimism. So let's look at the text. Rabbi Zushia and his brother Rabbi Elimelech were once discussing the subject of humility. Elimelech said, if one contemplates the greatness of the Creator, he or she will arrive at true humility. But Zushia said, no, one must begin by being truly humble. Only then will he or she recognize the greatness of the Creator. So they asked their teacher, the Maggid of Mezerich, who was right. He decided this way. These and those are the words of the living God, but the inner grace belongs to the one who begins with oneself and not with the Creator. Mm-hmm. So let's figure out what this means. and how it compares to text number 2. What role might suffering play in the perspective of Rabbi Zusha? Because we know that he was very, very poor. Do you think that he was humble because of his situation? Or do you think that he was humble before it? And remember, that kind of is what this whole conversation is about. So the Maggid of Mezerich adds to the understanding of this by saying you should begin with what's in yourself, not with your situation. And I think that knowing their situation can add to this text. Sorry. And how might we take this and apply it to the environment? Okay. What I see when I think about this is that if you apply the contemplating the greatness of the Creator, which is actually outside, which is kind of the opposite of what the Maggid said, but if you do that, you'll have a humble approach towards the environment. Tradition says that the world doesn't belong to us until we say a blessing. And to me, that implies humility towards the environment. Does anybody want to jump in at any point? Sorry.
Well, we're supposed to be the keepers of the earth while we're here.
Mm-hmm.
So as the keepers, that makes us responsible for it.
That's correct.
So, if you come from that perspective, before anything occurs in your lifetime that might make you more humble, it's an understanding. It's sort of like you're born. This is the cards that you're dealt with as you're born. You okay there?
Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm getting my phone up. You're right. So having that attitude towards the environment actually is a humble attitude, and we're seeing the connection between having humility and actually taking care of the earth. And I think that having humility and feeling responsibility towards both the earth and towards other people is a really good way to have people respect us as well. I read, you'll see in one of our supplemental materials that is pointed out, and I think it's
just a quick question that where it said Maggid. Does Maggid mean? Does that mean teacher, or what does Maggid mean there?
So the word Maggid in Hebrew means to tell. And a Maggid would be a respected person who they listened to. The Maggid of Mezerich was actually their teacher, their highly respected higher teacher.
Okay, so it's an esteemed teacher.
Yeah, it's an esteemed teacher.
Okay.
Okay.
I have some Maggids in my family, and I was wondering if there's something.
Yes, I know some too.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it's a common name, but it is if you have someone with that name, that's a very respectable old Hebrew name.
That's great. Okay.
But he called himself Maggid. He didn't call himself Maggid, but I'm sure it was Maggid. Okay. Now, this is an interesting text we're coming to because when I read it, I felt like it was taking humility to a new level. And I'm not sure actually whether I agree with this. So I would like very much to see how you feel about it. This was written by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who's a very famous rabbi. You might already know about him because he's famous, but it might be interesting to talk about him so that we can connect to the text. So a quick history. He lived from 1772 to 1810. He was a great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. The town that he came from is sometimes called Bratslav, but sometimes called Breslov. And that's because they say that Breslov comes from the Hebrew words bris and lev, meaning covenant of the heart. He was one of the most creative, influential, and profound of the Hasidic masters, and he was a founder of the Breslover Hasidic sect. From his youth, he followed asceticism. There was a lot of that humility and asceticism. He warned his followers, though, not to abuse themselves physically. He emphasized living life with joy and happiness, and one of his best-known sayings is, "It's a great mitzvah to be happy." He wrote, this is interesting, I just learned this recently, he wrote 13 tales mythical stories about kings and wizards based upon Kabbalistic thought and capturing the essence of his teachings. But here's the part that I found interesting, even above this. These tales were known to have influenced later authors like Franz Kafka. It's very interesting. He died of tuberculosis at age 38. Despite the fact that there was never another Breslov Rebbe to fill his place, the mystery and the depth of his teachings continue to attract students even today. And the Breslover Hasidim is still one of the largest Hasidic groups. So let's look at what he said and what we think about it. Dear God, guide me along the path of sincere humility. Even if I put on airs, stop me. Bless me with a humble spirit, with eyes that see only the good in people, with a mind always open to others' opinions, with a heart always caring of their concerns. Teach me to humble myself even before the lowliest of your children, whose very brokenness brings them closer to you. Okay, so let's start with the idea of putting on airs. Why might a person put on airs? I think it's always good to understand why someone acts the way they do. And I think that they're doing this to cover up for an insecurity. So I can understand why Rabbi Nachman said that. Then he goes on, so this says something about vulnerability of another person. And I think in humility, we can deal with that person's vulnerability. That's very positive. But now let's talk about the humble spirit. Eyes that see only the good in people. I'm not sure that's a safe thing to do at this point in time. I'm not sure that's something I would want to teach my children to do, or that I would want to live myself that way. I jump in if you want to. I think it's very important to see the good in people, but I think it's most important to be honest about what you see. So I kind of split from Rabbi Nachman there. I think it's great to have a mind open to others' opinions. That's extremely important. And your heart should care about their concerns. But again, you have to care about their concerns without harming yourself, which is what Rabbi Nachman said. So,
I agree with you in that you can't always only see the good. You can start by seeing the good.
right.
And if you want to help that person or heal that person, you can focus on the good, but you don't ignore the other.
Exactly. Well said. And that brings us back to our humility spectrum, where we're looking for that middle ground. We don't want to be a doormat. We want to be a whole person who definitely sees the good in people. That's extremely important.
When I do chaplaincy work, I have to be careful to focus on the good, because sometimes you let judgment come in, and judgment will say, does this person this person may or may not value my time or deserve my time. You can't do that. You have to focus more on the good without being blind.
That's an excellent point. Really excellent point. That's right. You can't judge people, and you have to keep that in mind. You have to remind yourself of that, especially in that kind of situation. You're completely right, and that's very important, I think. Thanks for bringing that up. So this brings us to our practices, which I think are really interesting practices to help cultivate this midah. The first one is in your pocket. So Rabbi Simcha Bunim of, I can't even say his name, Peshishka, he taught, this is very important, everyone must have 2 pockets with a note in each. So he or she can reach into one or the other depending on the need. When feeling lowly and depressed, discouraged, or disconsolate, one should reach into the right pocket and there find the words, "For my sake was the world created." But when feeling high and mighty, one should reach into the left pocket and there find the words, "But dust and ashes."
What if you don't know your left from your right?
Then you might be really surprised at what you pull out. But it's good to remind yourself when you're feeling too proud of yourself, not to be arrogant.
Right.
But it's also important when you're feeling terrible to remind yourself that you have some self-worth. And this is all about equanimity in the spectrum of humility. So I really like this. Pam Wax, who wrote the curriculum, I met her at a workshop she was doing, and she did this there. And I think this is why I asked her to write the curriculum, because I just love this. This is my favorite practice. Let's look. We have some other really nice ones too. Personal space. So think about whether you're taking up too much, too little, or just the right amount of space. You can try out different settings for the practice to get a sense of how your humility may be influenced in different circumstances. So if you're uncomfortable with how much or how little space you take up in any particular setting, try to calibrate your interaction. This could mean that you might be the first to speak up in a situation where you're typically silent, or be sure to let everyone else speak during a conversation where you usually dominate. We did this for the teens. We had a really nice activity. It's called Wait. You say to yourself, why am I talking? And you wait to make sure that it's the correct thing to do. And along the same lines, notice how much physical, not just emotional space you take up in a shared space, both at home and in public. So we were talking before about being on the bus and putting your pocketbook on the seat next to you. Or I live on a boat, so I'm pretty aware of space I take up. But that's an important part also of the kind of space you take up, both emotional and physical. And then a third one, which I love, take note of your vanity. When do you tend to demand or want attention or praise? And what's motivating that need? Because that is another a way of taking up space, needing to be, needing attention.
We all know somebody that we say they take up all the air in the room.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And it's funny because you can feel it. You can actually feel it, although you probably can't measure it at this point. Like, I'm sure if somebody came in and measured the oxygen, we can still breathe, but sometimes we feel like we can't. So that's a very interesting way to look at it. Then this is very nice too. This is an interesting thing for your participants to try with each other. According to tradition, Moses was considered the most humble person on earth because he prayed on his sister Miriam's behalf, despite the fact that she had badmouthed him. So use Moses as a midah model. Try to maintain a sense of equanimity, even when under fire, and deal with criticism. So one way to practice this outside of your normal life, each person with a partner take turns giving a compliment or giving constructive criticism to his or her partner. Flip a coin. If it lands on heads, the compliment comes first. If it lands on tails, the criticism comes first. And take note of how you can maintain a sense of equanimity in each situation. It's interesting because the standard Chai Mitzvah materials, the third one of them is on Tochecha, how to give constructive criticism. It's something that I think people don't really want to do because it's very difficult, but it's actually a mitzvah and you're commanded to do it. It's required to do this. But you have to look at what your motivation is for why you're giving this. And you have to think about the words you use. It's really quite complicated. So this is an interesting activity to do. And I think you might enjoy trying this with a partner. You can learn a lot about yourself by doing this as well.
I think we tried an exercise like this in our sisterhood. Was the first, where everybody was there. Wasn't just the board and open meeting. And it worked out really well because people got to know people that didn't know other people. Was a way of them getting to know those people. So.
It's a very interesting icebreaker indeed.
Yeah.
Because it is constructive criticism as well as compliments. It's wonderful. I think it's a good practice too because we're all in situations, we're trying as hard as we can to do everything right. And if someone gives us constructive criticism, we might sometimes actually find that, we're having a hard time with it.
It also gives perspective that they can see how other people see them.
That's right. That's a very interesting thing too. And when we're talking about humility, that's a really, that's an important thing to see. So it's a very good exercise. Here's the next one. And this is also really relevant for today. One of the things we think about today is how the environment is important because people are, they're getting ill now and we have extreme weather. One of the things about this humility practice is also very relevant because we have such a divide in our country now with people's opinions. So part of the great divide in our country today is about our unwillingness to hear opinions with which we disagree. If, as Rabbi Nachman of Wroclaw suggests, it's a humility practice to have a mind always open to others' opinions, switch your news source. If you're used to reading or listening to liberal media, switch to a more conservative source or vice versa. Try to listen without judgment. And now take this practice out into the world and try to listen deeply to someone whose opinions you generally disagree with, keeping your heart open and aiming to be empathetic. I think we should try that. We're taught in Pirkei Avot that one who is wise is the person who learns from every person, and that the person who is honored is the person who honors others. As a humility practice, be mindful of what you can learn from others and of treating all others as created in the divine image. I think that's a really great part of humility, which is that we can actually make the world better. I always say, I can't change the whole world, but I can change those that I touch. And I think if we act this way, just our circle of people we touch can be more positive. Mm-hmm. It's not always easy, but I think it's a very good outgrowth of this humility practice. And now some interesting links to additional information. COJL, you might have heard of them, the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life. They deepen and broaden the Jewish community's commitment to stewardship and protection of the earth. So they have outreach, they have activism, they have Jewish learning. You can go to their website, which is shown there. They're excellent. And then this is an interesting suggestion. Join an organization like the NAACP or Sisters of Salam, in which you will be interacting with and hearing the concerns of others from a culture that's different from your own. So I think that we have that. A lot of actually Chai Mitzvah groups do that on some level. And I think that kind of embodies this humility thing. You don't have to agree with everybody. You just have to interact with them and learn about them. They may not agree with us either, but we have to learn how to coexist. So I think that's an interesting suggestion. Other interesting stuff. These are good. There's an animated film entitled Jewish Food for Thought, and there's one about humility. And here's a link to it. And there's a study guide for this. It's a nice humility text. The next one, the picture book Zoom. Has anyone heard of this picture book?
No.
It's awesome. I've used it. It's a great tool for teaching about humility. It starts out with what looks like a picture of, I think it's like a person. And as you move out and out and out, you realize that you're seeing a little tiny bit of a picture, and you're seeing more, then you're seeing more, until you're seeing it from the perspective like you're out in space and you see the whole world. What you started with, you thought was like important, and then you see its place in the world. Very interesting. And you can also get this book online, slides, if you want to look at it. You might want to use it with your group. And then there's a Talmudic story about a rabbi who mistreated an exceedingly ugly man. It's about self-righteousness and forgiveness and humility and flexibility. It's a nice story. And you can also find it online at onefoot.org. So that's interesting. Now, some really interesting supplemental materials. This one's called Humility Isn't Always Nice. It's a guy who describes the characteristics of a humble person. And it's really interesting because, I think from reading, for example, Rabbi Nachman of Wroclaw, we think, or I used to think of humility as like being a doormat, but it's not. It's kind of like being outside of the things that people care about. Like a humble person probably doesn't really care if they're wearing the most stylish clothes. They've got other concerns. They're not focused on themselves. They're not going to take up a ton of airspace like we were talking about before. But they are going to contribute, and they'll be focused on things. This is definitely worth the read. It's very interesting. It's short. You should definitely read Journey from Hero to Humility. It's an Eli talk, I think, or a TED talk. I think it's a TEDx talk. This woman, Dr. Christine Gibson, she was in Nepal during a big earthquake in 2015. And she was a doctor and she was there for work, but she wasn't a surgeon. She didn't speak the language, and she wasn't really able to help people during this disaster. And it was interesting because she didn't have surgical skills. She didn't have like emergency skills. She didn't speak the language, so she couldn't really like do what needed to be done. And it made her look at the world in a different way. And so I think you enjoy this. Again, these are things you might want to use with your groups because they're very interesting. Other supplemental material, Leadership Without Ego. This is interesting. And you might find yourself wanting to see this. It's another Eli or TED Talk. And then The Humble Leader. This is really cool. It's a Godcast cartoon video, but it's based, and it's about Moses, based on how Lewis's talk. It ain't the heat, it's the humility. Jewish leadership for the 21st century. So I linked to both of those there, and I think you'll find both of them really interesting, really worthwhile to use with your group or to see on your own and then comment on it. Have people watch at home. It's just really good. That's good. And then the last thing to talk about is the personal reflections, which are the independent topics for the participants. So you know, each source book includes questions on the back cover to help focus people on their independent projects. So it's nice at the end of the session or at the beginning, whenever you like to do it, take a couple of minutes to look at the questions on the back cover and have each participant answer them, either in writing or share as a group, whichever works better for you. So the quote for this month's topic it's from Ecclesiastes. It relates to cause and effect, both in nature and in our actions, which is what we've been talking about. And how does it speak to your independent projects? All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the waters flow, there they return again. So what does that mean to us?
What we put out comes back.
Yes. And so if we're doing these independent projects, we can feel extra good about them. I think a lot of times it's not that I do something good for someone and they'll do something good back for me. I'll do something good for someone and I'll just feel good.
That's right. It comes back. It's a back.
Exactly. I think it comes back that way. So that's something that I think is important to focus on in your group as well. And that leads us to our Q&A part of the webinar.
Sometimes you have to sell that. You have to sell that to kids when you're raising kids or talking to teenagers.
Yeah.
You know,
a whole other thing. We had a webinar yesterday about this, about humility in teenagers, and because they're focused, their time of life right now is they're just figuring out who they are. They're completely focused on themselves. So to be humble, to focus on someone outside of you, is a stretch. But it's still good to talk about humility in terms of getting yourself calibrated, because we don't want to make the mistake of making them think they're the center of the universe. You're the center of our universe.
That's why they say that Jewish women raise princes that other women later on in life cannot match. So we have to learn that we have to be humble with our kids too.
Yes, we do have to teach them some humility. I have all girls, so I didn't raise any princesses, just princesses. But I think it's important, and I think really for your kids, you're not doing them any favors to make them that way. So instead of the humility, not in the way we talked about in text number 3, not in you become humble after you suffer, but just in knowing your place in the world, like in the book Zoom. That I think is a good thing. Definitely important, so that you don't find out that you're actually, you're not the center of the universe, but you have an important place in the universe. I was talking yesterday to one of the educators, and we were talking about how if you look at creation, it makes you feel humble. And she said, yes, but it also makes you feel awesome because you're part of this amazing thing. Mm-hmm. And I like that, so I'm sharing it with you as well.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, everybody. Is there any comments or questions? Okay, well, thank you, especially Harriet, for speaking up. And for those of you on the phone and not able for me to see you, thank you also for joining. And I will send a follow-up email with lots of info. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Can we get print this out so we have all the websites and all that?
Yes, definitely. I'll close it. I'll add it to the follow-up email.
Okay, thanks a lot. Take care.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.